G'day everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be looking at changing the suspension bushers in the front lateral control rod, also known as the Panhard Rod, of this 80 Series Landcruiser behind me. But the same process and part numbers are also going to apply to the 70 and 105 Series cruisers as well. So let's get into it. Up underneath the front of the car now, we've got our axle housing here and our relay rod or drag link, then our Panhard rod is in between the two. So it's connected to the chassis at this end and to the axle housing at the other. And the role of that Panhard rod is to control side to side motion of the body and chassis above the axles, or in other words, to keep that body and chassis centered on the axles when we go around a corner or when we're bouncing around off-road. Now you'll notice that the factory Panhard rod is a fixed length, meaning that as we lift this side of the vehicle, for example, by installing a large lift kit, it's going to pull the whole body over that way. The way that we correct for this, for example, typically if we're installing a lift kit larger than about 2 inches or 50 millimeters, is to replace this with an adjustable Panhard rod, meaning that we can extend it to the length it needs to be, such that the body and chassis sits centered over the axles, and we don't end up with the wheels poking out one side but not the other. At each end, we've got these rubber bushings, and because they're rubber, they do deteriorate over time, and then you can get play in these connections, which can lead to poor handling and poor steering. So we're going to be replacing these as preventative maintenance. I'm just going to quickly run through all the tools and parts we're going to need to do the job, but as always there'll be a full list along with timestamps to skip ahead down in the description below. We've got a metric socket set with two 22mm sockets and a short extension. We're going to need either a long socket wrench or a breaker bar because these bolts are quite tight, and I've got a torque wrench capable of about 130 foot-pounds or 170 newton meters. For the parts we're going to be installing, the factory Toyota bushers are rubber, there's one there. I'm going to be installing a couple of high quality aftermarket rubber bushers from Tamer. And we're also going to need a couple of new bolts and a new nut because we're going to be replacing these when we do the bushers as per the factory service manual. I've got some safety glasses and nitrile gloves for protection. I've got some paper towel, degreaser, brake and parts cleaner, and a small brass wire brush works really well for cleaning up those parts. We're going to need a hydraulic press to do this job, as with all the other front and rear bushers in these vehicles. So I'm going to be using a 20-ton shot press. You can pick these up for fairly cheap if you just go for the basic bottle jack in a frame style. And I've got a couple of press kits here as well. The main one we need is the press sleeves. Now the outside diameter of these bushers is 40 millimeters. So I'm going to be using a 34 by 44 millimeter sleeve and a 52 by 42 millimeter. And I'll explain why a bit later in the video. And I've also got a press disc. The main one you'll need is the 39mm for pressing out the old bushers. As always, don't forget to chock your wheels before you jump underneath the car. Now at this end on the chassis up here, we've got a bolt and a nut, and we're going to turn the bolt rather than the nut because the nut has serrations on the back side which will keep it in place. And at the other end, we just have a bolt because there's a captive nut inside the axle housing there, so we just remove that bolt and replace it. So I'll grab my 22mm socket. Worth noting as well, you can rotate this relay rod just to get yourself a little bit more clearance. And that should just pop out. You may need to put a 22mm socket on the back end to stop the nut from spinning once it gets slightly loose, but this one came off alright. Now for the other end, I'm going to be using an extension so that I can clear that relay rod, and again it's the 22mm socket. Now you can throw those old bolts and nut away because we're going to be replacing those. You can see there that that rubber's in quite poor condition, so it's definitely a good thing that we're replacing these. I want to quickly talk about the methodology before we jump over to the press. So on the front Panhard rod at both ends the bore is 40 millimeters, which corresponds to the outer steel casing on the bush. So these bushers are made up of the steel casing with rubber in the middle there. Inside they have this raised lip, which is a steel crush tube, which the bolt clamps down onto. When we press the old bushers out, we're going to use a 39mm disc, so slightly less than 40, and we're just going to press on the end of there, and that's going to press the bush through, and the disc can go through the bore in the Panhard rod as well without damaging it. And you might be thinking, well, why don't we do the same thing when we press the new bushes in? And the reason is that by pressing on the end here, we're actually putting the rubber in shear and potentially damaging the bush. So we don't want to do that with the new ones. Instead, we're going to use the 44 by 34 millimeter sleeve, which is going to fit nicely on the end, and it's going to contact the end of that steel casing and press it that way instead. And additionally, it's not going to fit through the bore, so we're going to know that we're finished when the end of this sleeve starts to contact the Panhard rod, because the width of the bush is the same as the width of the rod, so we're going to know we're all the way home and it's not sticking out on either side. Now underneath, we're going to need to support that rod while we're pressing the bushes through, and to do that we're going to need a size that corresponds to the circular part but is also large enough internally to fit the bush through, and the size I'm using for that is a 52 by 42 millimeter sleeve. So that's going to sit underneath, and then when the old ones are coming out, we're going to use our 39 millimeter disc to press them through, and then when the new ones are going in, we're going to use our 44 by 34 millimeter sleeve on top. So let's jump over to the press. The most important thing with this is that we take our time to get it lined up perfectly straight and then just press it through. That way we're not going to press the bush or our tools into the bore and damage the Panhard rod. I'm pretty happy with how that's looking, so I'm going to start to press it through. Now you may hear a loud bang like that. You'll feel that you start to pump up and you get more and more resistance, and then it lets go. That's just stored energy. The bush is quite tight inside there, and if these haven't been changed for a while, it can take quite a bit of force to get them out. Now I'm going to need to pop a press pin in here. You can see that the bush has started to come out of the bottom there. Just lower that down to the next height setting. And then we can continue to push it through. And there we go, that's dropped out. And there's that old bush. That one can go in the bin. And we're going to clean up those bores before we put the new bushes in. Then we can flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. Alright, so I'm happy that's all lined up nicely. So we'll start to press that other bush through. Over on the workbench now to do some cleaning. Now I've already wiped down the whole Panhard rod with some degreaser and some paper towel off camera. You want to use degreaser on the painted areas because it's not going to strip the paint, whereas brake and parts cleaner is good on bare metal. So I'm going to focus primarily on the bores. We want to make sure that there's no deep grooves or anything like that inside the bores which are going to potentially damage the new bushes, or any sharp edges around the lip where it starts to press in. So a brass wire brush is really good for cleaning up. It's a soft metal and it won't scratch the steel, but it will do a really good job of cleaning it. But these aren't looking too bad at all. Then I'm going to wipe that out with some brake and parts cleaner on some paper towel. Again, try not to get this on the painted sections. I'm happy that those are nice and smooth. You can see that the width of our Panhard rod is the same as the width of the new bushes that we're pressing in. In other words, we're just going to press until it's flush with one side, and then it'll be flush with the other as well. And we're going to have our Panhard rod with the side that has the small chamfer on it facing upwards. So that's a small lip that's just going to help that new bush get started into the bore. 52 by 42 sleeve, same as before. And these bushes aren't directional. Some are, but these ones can go any orientation. 44 by 34 sleeve to press it in. And then we just need a disc that's larger than that sleeve. I'm using 50 millimeters, but it doesn't really matter. Now the most important thing using this type of press is just to really take your time to get everything lined up perfectly. You can easily damage the bore or damage the new bush if you rush. And unfortunately, this type of press is pretty hard to get perfectly aligned. You get what you pay for. I'm going to start slowly and just double check that it's going in square. I'm happy with how that started, so I'm going to press it home. You can see that's looking nice and square. So I'm just adding a couple more discs on top just to get that last little bit. Bottle jack's running out of travel. These kits that I'm using with the discs and the sleeves, they're not super expensive. They range from about $100 to $200 Australian depending on the quality, and it really helps, as you can see, to have lots of different options. and that's home. So you can run your finger around just to make sure that it's flush on both sides, but that's looking pretty good. I'm happy with that. So then we'll flip it over and do the same thing on the other end. And that's bottomed out. Back underneath the front of the car now, and I've just given the two mounting points at each end a quick wipe with some degreaser and some paper towel, and just made sure there's no sharp burrs that are going to damage the new bushes when we put them in. So I'm going to start over at the axle end, and there's only one way that it can go. You can see there's a bend in the Panhard rod to fit around the radius arm here. So we'll pop that up and into position. Might just have to wiggle it in a little bit, and I've just got to line up the bolt holes. And as we said before, Toyota specify in the service manual that we should replace the bolts and nuts. So I'm just going to put that end in loosely for now. I'm going to pop my bolt in from this side facing towards the back of the car. That's through, and then pop my nut on the back side. I'm just going to loosely snug these down with a 22mm socket, but we don't want to tighten them just yet. An important thing to note before we move forward is that if we were doing this job on a hoist or we had the car raised up, we need to lower both wheels back to the ground before we torque up these two bolts. When the suspension droops or compresses, it's going to put stress through these bushes, and we don't want to clamp it in that position and pre-stress the bushes, because that's going to cause them to fail sooner. And secondly, as per the factory service manual, before we tighten these up, we want to stabilize the suspension, and the way they say to do that is to bounce the vehicle up and down. So I'm going to quickly do that now. So now that I've stabilized the suspension and I've got the bushes in an unloaded condition, I'm going to torque up these bolts, and I'm going to start with this one up here. Because of those serrations on the back of the nut that are going to hold it in place, I'm going to torque the bolt head. And we're tightening these to 127 foot-pounds or 171 Newton meters. There we go, same on this one. That's it for changing the front Panhard rod bushes on the 80 series. Now we are planning on working through all the front and rear suspension bushes on this car, so stay tuned. We'd love to hear from you, so if you've got any feedback for us or something you'd like to see in a future video, please drop us a comment down below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.